You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I am recording here in the weekend of our nation's birthday. I'm July 6th, but of course our birthday was celebrated on Friday this past week. But nevertheless, doing some recordings here, trying to push out the envelope here a little bit because I've got some travel I've got to do coming up here soon. So trying to get some of these podcasts out in order so I don't miss a week. Nevertheless, glad to have you on board, of course. If you're wondering what the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast is all about, well, we're all about the technical information related to wildlife damage management. So anything involved with the management of animals with a spine, not humans. I don't believe humans are animals, but any animal with a spine. We're interested in covering those topics from a technical research-based perspective. So we're a little bit more unique in that regard. So nevertheless, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts, comments, even criticisms of the show, perhaps ideas that you would have for future shows. We'd love to hear from you. Of course, if you're interested in having a spot on the show, in terms of you want to be interviewed for a particular project that you're working on, perhaps a new product or service that you're trying to sell, we'd love to hear from you. Again, you can reach me at Wildlife Control Consultant. Do suggest, however, that you go back, and I have a podcast on how to be on the show. So please listen to that before you reach out to sort of save some time for everyone involved. All right, well, since we're here in kind of the middle of summer for many people, one more thing, just pointing out some of the things we have for sale from my website. You can see some of the books that we have available and also some of the services that I provide. I do have a training. If you're interested in the theory and concepts behind baiting of cage and box traps, this is a self-directed learning. It's about almost 1 hour of training. It's got like 11 different modules to work your way through, and it takes you through an approach that you probably haven't thought of doing if you've ever done some cage trapping. And then, of course, I have expert witness testimony and then webinar-based training, as well as some work with PowerPoints. If you are interested in learning having me work with your PowerPoint, perhaps you have to do a presentation somewhere and you want to get that kind of put together, so definitely reach out to me. You can see the price for my consult and 60 minutes of editing time on it, which can, believe it or not, cover a lot if you give me the raw materials. So nevertheless, you can reach out and talk to me about it. Would love to hear from you. All right, enough of all that. Well, this week, because we are kind of in the middle of the summer, a lot of people are going to be struggling with some wildlife damage. And of course, you know that many people, we are enamored in America with chemicals, right? So we think that chemicals can solve all of our problems, better living through improved chemistry, right? And so we think that chemicals can solve everything. So a lot of people are out buying things that are going to repel different types of vertebrate pests away from their property. Again, I'm only talking about vertebrate repellents, vertebrate pesticides here. Not talking about repellents related to insects. That's a whole different discipline. But people go out and buying things, and they're having mixed results, and I wanted to sort of introduce people into the world of repellents because sometimes it helps when you have sort of that macro vision of what repellents are and what they're not, can help you understand how to use them to their best effect. And that would be the way to go there. So let's get started. And the title of this, of course, is Repellents Beyond the Hype, right? So let's get our definitions straight here, because sometimes people aren't always clear about what a repellent is. And so my definition of a repellent is that it's a chemical, whether natural or biological. By that means, like could be like urine. That's a natural chemical, of course, or something that's manufactured by man-made, And it's going to be something that's typically going to be regulated by the Environmental Pesticide Agency, right? Environmental Protection Agency. Excuse me, I got to get that out right. So the EPA regulates pesticides, of which a lot of people are sort of surprised to hear that repellents, yes, are considered pesticides according to the EPA. If you go onto the EPA website, look up what their definition of a pesticide is. Again, that would be a legal definition. It's anything that's designed to control, diminish, curtail, repel a pest. And of course, repellents fall under that particular category. And so they regulate both its purchase and its use in terms of these pesticides, right? So repellents typically are not restricted use products, but but there's always a chance that they can be. Some, I believe, might be, but I'm not aware of any off the top of my head at the moment. But there could be a couple outliers that are going to be restricted use. But as a general, but they're still regulated by the EPA. Now that differs from a frightening device. Now a device should let you know that it's a non-chemical thing. So you're not spraying something. These are typically things that deal with sound, deal with light. Sometimes you have a light and sound together, or a biological sound like a screeching, say a mountain lion perhaps, or a hawk. These are non-chemical products that are used to typically frighten an animal away from an unwanted place. And so one is a device, typically not regulated by states or the EPA. EPA typically doesn't regulate devices. And so it's different from a repellent. A repellent is a chemical that is going to be regulated by the EPA, and they will typically have an EPA number or a 25B number. Okay, so we're going to be talking today not about devices, not about the owl that people put up on their fence. I'll talk about frightening devices at another time, but to this we're talking about repellents, which are chemicals regulated by the EPA, or if you're in a different country, regulated by whatever federal or state agency that regulates pesticides. Okay? All right, so before we get too far into this, of course, because it is a pesticide, I just need to remind everyone, those of you involved in the pest control world are probably sick and tired of hearing it. I admit that at times I'm tired of saying it, but the label is the law. Right? So that means you are responsible when you purchase these repellents. Again, they are pesticides. They may not kill anything, but they are considered a pesticide as a legal definition that they are under the regulatory authority of the Environmental Protection Agency. That's in the United States. Other countries will have different agencies. But nevertheless, there are regulations, as well there should be, right? We don't want people misusing chemicals because bad things can happen that way. But you have to follow the label. It's sort of a contract between the manufacturer and you. And so in order for the manufacturer, when they're selling you this product and they want you to use it appropriately, because there are ways to misuse chemicals and that you can have bad effects. So when the EPA registers a product, they balance efficacy with safety. And so that's where that label comes from, that they want efficacy. We all want things to work, right? But we want them to work safely. So as I sarcastically teach to talk to people, I tell them nuclear weapons will control your XYZ problem. And people laugh. And I said, but I hope you don't use them. But obviously, there are serious consequences by using a nuclear weapon to control a particular animal, right? And so it's kind of a ha-ha moment. Everyone knows I'm kidding on this, right? But sometimes we forget that some of these chemicals that we're using have negative effects, right? And that there could be some dangers with them. And so we want to be sure that we're using the chemicals appropriately with good effect, so that we're also not harming the environment or non-target animals. So The label is going to tell you where you can use the chemical. That's the site of application. The volumes that you're allowed to use it. And what kind of personal protection equipment? Do you need to wear gloves when you're applying it? Do you need to have a respirator when you're applying it? Do you have to have long sleeves, long pants, and shoes that cover your feet? Or can you wear flip-flops, right? So that's what that label is going to tell you, and you as an applicator need to follow this label. And I want to be very clear about this. Do not simply rely on the information provided to you by the salesperson. Sometimes people go into hardware stores and they pick up a rabbit repellent or a deer repellent, and they listen to the salesperson, who may be well-meaning, and then they forget to read the label or refuse to read the label. Unfortunately, it is very hard for a salesperson to know everything about all the products that they're selling. Secondly, I have seen too often salespeople simply get the information wrong. Ultimately, you are responsible as an applicator how that product is used. So don't simply say, oh, well, the salesperson told me to do this. No. You are ultimately responsible for how that product is used. Read the label before you use the product. I recommend people to read the label before you purchase the product. Yeah, it may seem weird you staring in the aisle reading that label because it's really small print, so bring your glasses, but read the label because you want to make sure that it will fit your circumstances, right? Is it the right site for the application? Will you be able to apply the amount? And do you have the proper PPE, the personal protection equipment, to use this particular product to see if it fits? Sometimes people buy things and then they misuse the product because they're in the wrong site. Maybe the site may be the back 40 and you're using it on your mowed lawn, and then you violated the label. All right? Okay, enough preaching about that. Just be careful. Be sure you're following that label before you purchase it. Okay? All right, so now there are different categories of repellents. So researchers have classified repellents according to sort of how they work, right? So what is their mode? Think of how their mode of action. And so we're not dealing with a, like a chemical mode of action in the sense of does it attack the neurological system of an organism, right? Like some of our pesticides that we use on bugs. But these are more about the sensory experience of the animal that they're going to repel. And so they categorize them in broadly these 5 areas, and I've put 2 of them in the same box because they are typically closely related to one another. In other words, odor repellents typically base on fear. Not always. There could be a noxious element to it, but typically most of your odor repellents have some sort of fear component to them. Okay, so basically, let me read this off for those of you that are driving. Okay, so we have fear repellents, we have odor repellents, and I've already said those 2 go really close together. Then we have what's called conditioned-aversion, and I have a picture of someone leaning over a toilet, right? So you have conditioned-aversion means that the animal consumes the product, gets an upset stomach, and gets either nausea. Typically it's not vomiting, but it's nausea. It's a bad effect. And therefore they avoid the area because they said, look, I ate over there. It didn't settle well with me. I'm going to leave that area alone. Then we have what's called taste repellents. These are usually bittering agents that make it hard for an animal to eat a product because it just tastes so bad. And then lastly, we have tactile repellents where an animal doesn't like to touch the surface treated with that particular repellent. Typically, those are sticky type products. So those are basically our 5 types of repellents, and again, two of them, as I said, fear and odor, go really close together. So that is a broad overview of the categories of repellents. And the reason why it's important for you to know that, so that you know what the mode of action is of that repellent, right? And so that way you would know, okay, well, I tried an odor repellent, didn't work that well. Maybe I want to combine it with maybe a conditioned-aversion repellent, right? So or a taste repellent, or maybe a tactile repellent. So you can do some of these in combinations, right, to try to maybe get better success with the type of repellents. But you have to have a way to sort of categorize them. And that's the list you have. So let's deal with the first one. I'm going to deal with them together, fear and odor. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the three aspects of a repellent. That is, where does it come from, or what's its source? How does it work? And then I give you some examples, and then I give you what the application is. In other words, is it a spot application? Is it an area application? So fear and odor repellents, typically these are like predator odors, and sort of if you put around certain urines, and for a prey species, they smell that urine from a predator, and they know that it makes them think a predator is nearby, and they don't want to be near it because they know that predators mean danger. And so that's where that fear comes in, but they smell it, right? So they smell the odor coming off that predator urine, and that gives them the fear, and then they try to avoid the area. That's the theory behind it. There's also some repellents that are used just a noxious odor. In other words, it's sort of like if you were near a sewage plant, for instance. You're not afraid of the sewage plant, you just don't like the smell. So you're trying to avoid the sewage plant so that you don't keep getting exposed to the odor. There are some examples of that. Typically, mothballs is probably the classic example. Unfortunately, it's often an illegal use of mothballs, right? So mothballs, and if you look at the vast majority of labels, are labeled for insects, not for vertebrate animals. Nevertheless, people do use them that way, even if it's a violation or off use of the label, off-label use. Okay, so this is your discussion of fear and odor repellents. All right, so let's go to the next category, and let's talk about the tactile repellents. So the source of their repellency, again, it's like a gooey product. Think of it like if you've ever had syrup on your pancakes, for example, and sometimes the syrup gets on your fingers. A lot of people, like myself, we don't like sticky fingers. Well, the same thing when it comes to animals. They don't like stickiness on their fur. They don't like it on their feet. And so they will avoid areas with stickiness. So you would put this product on a surface that you didn't want that vertebrate animal to move around on. And so that's how it works. So these are the application spots, of course, are going to be specific locations, because you don't broadcast the goo, you place the goo in certain areas that you don't want the animal to step. And that's what makes it a very narrowly focused repellent. Now, an example of a tactile repellent would be polybutene-based bird repellents. These are typically oil-based repellents that have a long-lasting gooey stickiness to them, and they can last up to a year if they're properly protected from dust, okay, and debris. So that's your tactile repellent. The next category is going to be a taste repellent. And so the source of this repellency is going to be a bittering agent that makes the food less palatable. Think of it like someone taking the hottest chili hot sauce you can come up with and just smatter it all over your food. How hard would it be to eat your food? Now, those of you that love it hot, that's not going to be a problem. But most of us are going to be really problematic with our mouths burning, okay? And so this is how this works. And so it tells the animal, you need to go to somewhere else that doesn't have that taste on it and find, the plants that have that on them, right? And so Typically, this is on specific spots, but there can be some larger broadcasting, like if you have certain sprays, you can often spray bushes with it. And so it's not as specific as the goo. The tactile repellent can cover some larger areas with sprays, but typically it's just specific to various locations. And it has to cover the plant well, because if the plant is not covered well, the animal may just simply bite the parts of the plant that haven't been treated. Okay, so they don't get it. Classic example of a bittering agent, of course, is capsaicin. That's what makes your chili peppers hot, right? That capsaicin chemical. And so that is used on different plants so that herbivores, these are plant-eating animals, find that taste a little bit more bitter and move on to choose something else. And then last but not least, we have conditioned aversion. And as I said earlier, these are products that the animal has to ingest, so they have to eat a little bit of it, so you're going to have to suffer a little bit of damage. But the animal gets an upset stomach and then makes the association between the upset stomach and where they were eating. The analogy I give to people is, think of it as you were eating at a restaurant and a few hours later you're over the porcelain throne throwing up your guts. What's the likelihood of you going back to that restaurant in the near future? Well, the answer is pretty low, right? That's the kind of experience you're trying to give an animal, that they eat this product, have that experience, avoid the area because of the bad experience with it. Now, the application area, of course, is surface, and it can be area-based. You can apply these over some pretty large areas. And the classic example of a conditioned aversion repellent is anthraquinone. This is used to keep geese off of turf grasses. So geese love to eat grass, especially the kind of grass we like to have around ponds. And what you do is you spray this repellent over the grass. It bonds with the grass. The geese eat some of that grass, get an upset stomach, avoid that grass in the future and move to other areas. So because they don't want to have that nausea experience again. That's conditioned aversion, a very powerful form of repellency, to be sure. So why do people use repellents? Well, part of it's the halo effect, right? They think that repellents they're considered humane. Why? Because you're quote unquote not killing the animal, right? And for some people, they have the misguided notion that repellents are not chemicals like other pesticides that kill. While it's true that repellents don't kill, they are they're still pesticides in the legal sense of the word, right? They don't kill the animal, but they're still chemicals. In that sense, they're not chemical free. But sometimes people play a little mental math in their head and they kind of give a little bit more of a halo effect to repellents because there's no lethal side effects to it. And then they're like, oh, but it's not the same as a pesticide. Well, it is a pesticide legally, even if it doesn't have lethal effects. Okay. Other times people will look at repellents thinking that they're easy, right? They don't have to trap the animal. They don't have to kill the animal. They don't have to dispose the carcass. They don't have to deal with the animal. A lot of people are more comfortable spraying things rather than having to buy a trap, bait the trap, set the trap, monitor the trap, then kill the animal in the trap, or if it's legal in their area, to translocate it down the road. Other times people look at it as a low-cost option, right? Because, I pay $20 for this box of repellent versus it may cost me $40, $60, $80 for a trap, and I still haven't caught the animal. So they see this as a low-cost way of dealing with a potential problem. And then lastly, of course, they're convinced by advertising, right? So advertisers can sometimes make these things appear that, animals are going to scream in horror away from these repellents and leave. And so we're going to talk about that, about why you need to be a little bit more skeptical about any types of broad-based claims regarding the efficacy of repellents, because it's complicated, right? So let me explain that a little bit more for you. And that is, when we say that a repellent worked, what exactly do we mean by that, right? And so I'm not trying to just be cute here. I'm trying to make sure that our definitions are clear, because sometimes people have different definitions of what work means, right? So if you use a repellent, and are you asking that it eliminate the damage? In other words, that there is zero damage from an animal after you put out that repellent? Or do you mean that you've reduced the damage by 75%? Or is it 50%? Or any reduction in damage? Right? That's a big difference, right? So if your claim is, if you're having, let's say, a rabbit in your yard and it's eating your prized flowering plants, are you okay with the rabbit reducing his consumption by 50%? Would the repellent in your mind still work, even if the rabbit is doing some damage? He's just only doing it at half the rate he was doing it before. Would that be okay, right? Probably not, right? Most people in what I call urbanites, if you're in an urban area, right, you're in a city, most people, when they say something works, they want zero damage, right? They're not saying they want a reduction of damage. They want zero damage. So you're going to need to be sure on what exactly work means to you, right? Because if you read the scientific literature for those products that we have literature on, the researchers will say something worked if they're getting almost any effect whatsoever, as long as it's over the rate of probability, okay, or happenstance. The next question you need to ask is, how long should something last and work for it to be considered working? In other words, you can have a repellent that may keep all animals away from a particular plant for a day, but they'll be back on day 2. Well, does that work, or is that a failure, right? How long should the repellent last in your mind for it to work, to be considered working, right? So we have a qualitative understanding of repellency. How well does it stop an animal from working? Then we have a quantitative understanding. How long should it be repelling an animal? And so these are questions a lot of people don't have a clear understanding in their head. There's a reason why when you read the label, it'll tell you how often you need to reapply the product, right? So oftentimes you'll say, in 10 days you need to reapply the product, or after a rainfall you need to reapply the product. Well, if you apply it on day 1 and it rains on day 2, you're going to have to reapply the product, right? So sometimes we're negative on repellents. Oh, the repellent didn't work because we didn't follow the label, right? We're going back to that original statement there. The other challenge with repellents is that people tend not to proclaim their bad choices. So you only tend to hear about people that purchased a repellent who had good success with it, rather than hearing about how I applied it and it didn't work. Because people tend to be quieter about that, right? It's the same reason why manufacturers love to have guarantees. If you try the product for 30 days and you don't like it, ship it back, we'll refund your money. The vast majority of people, even when something doesn't work, will not send the product back. They won't go through the effort, right? So it's still a win for the manufacturer, right? So the same way when it comes to these repellents, you're often only going to hear the good news when a product worked. And so typically what I find with people is that they need to be thinking about, why did this repellent work? Did the repellent, quote unquote, work, whatever that means to the person telling you? Did it really work, or do we have a case of the mistaken cause? For example, you would have situations where people would say, I threw some mothballs down around my deck and the skunk left. Well, did the mothballs drive out the skunk, or did the skunk get hit by a car? Was that the repellent doing that, or was that the car that did it, right? The next thing is that sometimes people say, well, I put up some soap around my plants and that kept the deer away. Well, did the soap really keep the deer away, or did the deer find better food choices somewhere else? Right? And so this is the problem, in that sometimes people claim products worked when it really wasn't the product at all. There just happened to be a correlation between the event of the application of the repellent and an animal's independent choice to move somewhere else. So yes, it's complicated, right? So repellents are complicated. And so I hope that this has taken some of the mystery about repellents away, so that you can better understand and evaluate whether they work and how they work. But let me just simply say this. They're not a silver bullet for managing vertebrate pests. That's just a fact. If you've had great success with a repellent, awesome. Good for you. But for many people, the reality is that they haven't been that successful with repellents. I want you to use repellents both legally and wisely, but also with the awareness of their limitations and how hard it is to evaluate. You need to have good expectations for repellents, or should I say proper expectations for repellents, before you put a whole lot of faith in, right? You need to tone down your expectations and have reasonable ones, and you may find that some repellents out there get the job done for what you want. But if you have highfalutin standards up there that, this is going to be the magic cure, it's going to solve my problem forever, 100%, then we're really talking two different languages here. And I'll explain that more next week in my next podcast. Well, thanks for watching. You've been listening to Stephen Vantassel. I'm the host of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you like the channel, to ring the bell, to subscribe. Also to you can also put some comments down below if you want to interact with this particular podcast. And of course, if you have questions, comments, concerns, definitely reach out to me. You can see my email there at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to chat with you some more about repellents or other things involved in wildlife damage management. Thanks for your time, everybody. Till next time, take care.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.